This year's National People's Congress has just concluded in Beijing, with Chinese Premier Li Keqiang taking questions from global reporters. The premier touched upon a whole range of issues, from the global pandemic, the economy, the civil code of China, to the national security legislation on Hong Kong and Beijing's attitude towards Washington. To analyze what the Chinese premier had just said, I'm pleased to be joined by Liu Zhiqin, Senior Fellow of the Chongyang Institute for Financial Studies at Renmin University, Jimmy Flor-Cruz, Professor at Peking University and former CNN Beijing Bureau Chief, and later Rick Dunham, Visiting Scholar at Tsinghua University. That is our topic, and this is Dialogue. I'm Wang Guan. Jimmy, why don't I start with you? As CNN's former Beijing Bureau Chief, you probably attended Chinese Premier's press conferences more than any other members of the Foreign Press Corps in Beijing. Probably you asked more questions than any of your fellow foreign reporters. Your observation on the difference this year compared to the sessions you've attended in the past?
Well, this one is obviously abbreviated. It's shortened. It was postponed, but sort of less pomp and pageantry as the ones that I've attended in the past. There are less press conferences, shorter press conferences, and then you have a mix of actual and virtual contacts in these press conferences. You have people still wearing face masks, and the people who were conducting the interviews were on the other side of the hall through the prism of the TV screens. However, the fact that this has happened, even though postponed and abbreviated, is already a good sign that China is beginning to reboot. I think if the medium is the message, the fact that China was able to pull this through it shows that China is in the process of climbing out of the very, very desperate situation, and that there were substance, but also there's this message that China is back in business.
I must say, Jimmy, that you asked some good questions, and some of those questions will be remembered by people for a very long time. Professor Liu, on China's economy, on whether or not China will announce even more stimulus packages, here's what the Chinese premier had to say.
I think during this two sessions, many delegates and also the state government leaders...
Sorry, Professor Liu, if you hold on for a second, I want to play you what the Chinese premier had just said. 1 second.
Yes,
Do we have the
yes.
stop?
过去我们说过，不搞大水漫灌，现在还是这样。
We have repeatedly said that we will not flood China's economy with liquidity. We didn't do it then, we will not do it now. But the current unusual time requires extraordinary measures. Just as water is important to fish farming, sufficient liquidity is important to economic development. But excessive liquidity will induce froth in the marketplace, where some people may attempt to muddy the waters and fish for arbitrage. We must ensure that the measures taken are well focused and write a precise prescription to get ourselves out of the current hardship. New approaches must be employed as to where the money comes from and how it is spent.
Professor Liu, what do you make of Premier's emphasis on targeted, precise physical measures this time around?
I think the physical measures now in this two sessions has been very clear, that announced that we should have a prudent and also consistent monetary policy and also fiscal policy to support our economic development. And of course, we have to be cautious about international conditions and also new challenges that could be emerged in the near future, especially when we are coming to the so-called new globalization processing. We are facing a very great potential challenges. So physical measures and policies are very essential for China's stability, because stabilizing of our economy is the priority of the consideration of our central government. So this is the main point that we have to consider. Of course, we have our enough measures that to open up our market, especially we have also displayed a new budget and also new investment in the market in order to ensure, to safeguard our liquidity of the economy, also to safeguard the real economy. So in this way, there are two measures. One is cautious, the other is a consistent opening up. So this is the main principle of our fiscal policy in this year.
Well, Jimmy, you know, the Chinese premier emphasized social goals such as elimination of abject poverty, building Xiaokang society, well-to-do society by the end of the year. How do you make, can you explain to our Western audience how important are those social objectives to Beijing?
They remain social objectives that I know poverty alleviation, for example, is President Xi Jinping's paramount goal. But also, by doing so, they will be able to help the economy reboot. I mean, the fact that China did not set economic growth goals, specific goals, I think makes sense because even though China is beginning to reboot, that's only half of the equation. The other half is the uncertain situation in the other countries, in China's trading partners, and that's still, many of them are still languishing in negative growth. Many of them are still coping with the pandemic. So it makes sense that China does not set a specific economic growth target and instead focus on quality of growth as well as creating jobs. Jobs. That was Premier Li's constant message, and that makes sense. China needs to create jobs because China can only rely on domestic consumption largely in these very desperate times.
Professor Liu, I saw you nodding your head when Jimmy was talking about jobs. 9 million jobs, that was the pledge from the Premier, also from his government work report. Professor Liu, how do you think China, what are the opportunities and challenges when it comes to creating jobs?
I think it is a greater challenge for the creation of new jobs. 9 million new jobs is not an easy job, actually. Of course, this is a central and a priority of our government in the year to come. Actually, according to the information, as we know that if we try to create 9 million new jobs that were equivalent to 4% of GDP, the total value. So in this way, that we have to ensure that a normal growth rate of GDP of our economic development and to increase the opportunities of the new jobs. And secondly, of course, the real reason or the only possibility that to create new jobs with one is open up our market, because only market can absorb such a number of the job lookers. And secondly is the companies that, especially for the private companies, we should encourage these companies and enterprises to absorb of these new job hunters. In this way, two ways that we can solve this problem in due time. Otherwise, we still have bigger challenges, as we have already said, because we cannot rely on the international efforts. We should rely on our domestic work and creation.
Right. Jimmy, you've done many investigative pieces as a former CNN reporter, bureau chief in China. There are many questions surrounding implementation and enforcement when China announced its stimulus packages. You know, those money will go directly to local levels to subsidize income and those jobless. And also, Premier Li said there will be real name verification system, auditing, public oversight. How do you think what are the institutions that can be utilized to ensure enforcement?
I think you put your finger on the very, very important question, which is implementation. Quite often in China, the devil is in the details, right? China may have a very good program, but it's really in the implementation on the grassroots level where you have problems. So I think perhaps this one will force China even more to open its market, but also to adapt systemic changes or reforms. For example, more accountability, more transparency, because those are the ones that will ensure that the good projects, the good plans are implemented on the grassroots level.
Professor Li, do you have anything to add when it comes to implementation and enforcement?
I believe that for such enforcement, we should have two things to be done. The first is the policymakers should know the market and know the situation of the society. They should know the real requirements and what the people really need, especially for the new jobs hunters, whether they can be really focused and stressed on this job creation. And secondly, we should open up a new job opportunities to create a so-called new job matches or patterns in this way. Because we can create many new possibilities, not only in the companies, but they can also have some self-employee such business activities, that we should lift up all the bans and the regulations to give more freedom for the individuals to create their own jobs. We know that the Chinese people are very convinced and also experienced to have their own business activities in the past 40 years. They can create a great, marvelous achievements by creating their own business. So in this way, they are really a very big opportunity and a bright future. I think all the institutions, including the companies and also universities and also factories, they can also create the jobs creation. But really, the main force should be focused on the market and also the individual initiatives. They should be initiated to do the same thing.
Well, I think towards the end of the press conference today, Premier Li emphasized once again China's resolve, China's willingness to open its market further to foreign investors. He talked about a much shortened negative list, opening up trade and services. You know, he made the gesture well understood, well seen by the world that China is welcoming foreign investors. Professor Liu and Jimmy, from your vantage points, how has China delivered on this promise so far in the past year or so? Jimmy, why don't I start with you?
I think that's a welcome message that Premier Li said today about making China even more open. That will have to be followed through with specific measures. Shortening the negative list, for example, expanding China's market, opening it further to foreign investors, foreign businesses. Now, China has been through this many years ago. China has had to confront the same set of problems like job creation in the past. Now, I know China has a saying, 东方不亮西方亮, or something like that, right? It may be dark in the east, but it's bright in the west, and that's because China is such a continental-like market. It's a huge market, and China can rely on that with the resilience and resourcefulness of the Chinese to at least start to reboot the economy, generate more jobs, put more money into the pockets of the Chinese so that they will consume more, and that will restart the whole cycle again.
Well, I want to shift gears a little bit and talk about China's domestic legislation. One key piece of legislation is a law called Civil Code. It is considered to be quite unprecedented for a socialist country like China. When you think about the law basically elevating the status of personal rights, personal property, to the same level, at least on paper, to those of the state, the government. Professor Liu, what do you make of this Civil Code law?
I think the People's Code is quite essential and very important. As we know that in the past 70 years that in New China, that we have tried 4 times to discuss this point, but due to some reasons at that time that we could not proceed. Nowadays we have met the best time and opportunities to work out all these details, because this code including 6 sections in different perspectives, including personal rights and also including scientific, economic research, new technologies, human rights, and including the gene technologies. So all these methods and the perspective are really focused and interested by the people here. So this is a very, the first one, I think this is the first version of such a code in China, the history. This is really a big, a great step forward and also a great progress in the civilization of our new society. This is a very huge achievement, what we have got.
First of all, can you give us some detailed example on how the stipulations, items on civil code can help people like you and me to make our lives better, more protected, and more hassle-free?
I think I pay great attention to 2 points. The first point is property, because in China we still got to safeguard the personal, the private ownership in the property system, because in the last 10 years, 20 years we have a heated discussion on this subject. And this People's Code, I think we have a really clear, stimulated. This is very important for all the people that to know this. And secondly, is, we are very happy that to know that gene technology or gene cell technologies should be also monitored and regulated according to the laws, because all the researchers in clinic, in the hospitals, should be also governed and ruled by laws, by the code, not freely as before that we have no overall or general laws to covering such the discussions, covering such activities. Now after this outbreak of the virus, we know that how important that the genetic and the ethnic engineering system is so important for the human healthy.
Right. You know, other than the domestic issues, of course, the Chinese premier addressed concerns regarding China's foreign policy. Reporters asked him about China's attitudes towards Washington regarding economic decoupling or even a Cold War. Is Beijing willing to confront the U.S.? Here's what the Chinese premier has said.
Both countries stand to gain from cooperation and lose from confrontation. Getting Sino-US relationship right is in the interest of people of both countries and the whole world. Given the importance of this relationship, any problem that occurs in this relationship will be a cause of concern for the international community. As for Cold War, you know that we have all along rejected the Cold War mentality, and decoupling between major economies will do neither side any good. It is also harmful to the world.
Rick Dunham, welcome to our program. You've just heard from the Chinese premier saying that China wants a cooperative, coordinated, and stable relations with the U.S. The Chinese premier struck a pretty conciliatory tone, didn't he?
Yes, exactly. I think it's smart in one way, which is that anyone who directly engages with Donald Trump ends up in the mud. And it probably is not a good idea to have this debate on Donald Trump's terms, because he thrives in chaos. And what China is looking for, and what traditional American policymakers are looking for, is some sort of stability and progress over time, constructive engagement rather than chaos.
And then, do you think this relatively mild approach, how that will work, given the fact that the pandemic is not over yet in the U.S. and given the fact that election season is just heating up in Washington?
Well, truly, I think there are two issues there. One is long-term relations, thinking beyond Donald Trump, thinking beyond the election in November, and not doing anything that would damage relations, either if Trump loses and Joe Biden becomes president or if Trump is reelected. China doesn't want to do anything to make the situation worse. The second issue is that Trump and the Republican Party have decided that China is their best issue as a path to maintain control of the Senate and to reelect Trump. And so the worst thing that China can do politically in terms of American politics is to engage with Trump and to let him focus on China and Chinese government activities. And by taking a positive approach, a conciliatory approach right now, it takes away that political issue, or at least makes it less of a big issue in America. Remember that this past week, Donald Trump called Joe Biden Beijing Biden, and that's his new attack, his new nickname.
Right.
And the best thing that China can do is stay out of the U.S. election and let it be decided on other issues.
Well, on another issue of not foreign policy, but that concerns China's national security, is Hong Kong. A legislation was passed on Hong Kong. I want to ask you, Professor Liu, in Beijing, Premier Li said today that Beijing is not abandoning its one country, two systems policy. Beijing is trying to implement it more comprehensively and accurately. How do you look at the controversy, the debate surrounding this piece of legislation on Hong Kong?
I think one country, two systems is the key element of our foreign policy. Also is a very serious and holy promise that the Chinese government sent to the whole world, not only to the Hong Kong people. Because we promised to adopt one country, two systems, we'll continue to do it. But the so-called controversy is always artificially created by some Western politicians, because they always not like China to have the one system, one country, two systems to be successful. They always try to have some more contradictions, more fightings, and more problems between Hong Kong and the mainland. This is their interest. So I think this question is absolutely nonsense for the Western country politicians that to ask whether China still keep or remain the one country, two systems. Actually, China has done its best to maintain the stability in Hong Kong and also to maintain the situation under control. This is the interest of Hong Kong people.
Rick, do you agree with Professor Liu?
Yeah.
I have a different perspective on this. I think that most of the protests in Hong Kong have been organic and not by British intelligence or American intelligence. And I do think that the world remains committed as China to the concept of one country, two systems. And I think that the truth is going to be in the implementation of this new law. I mean, obviously the law gives the central government new and unprecedented powers over activities in Hong Kong. But the question is whether it's just another logical step in the 50-year transition that was agreed to with Great Britain at the time of the return to China, or if it's a major change. And we're going to see. We'll see about press freedom or financial corporate transparency or the ability to protest or seek redress of grievances over the next few months. Well, and if it's smooth, then that's important.
But I think some politicians are jumping to conclusions right here. For example, U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo said he has asked the U.S. Congress to withdraw its benefits granted to Hong Kong as a autonomous region, saying that it's now no more different than the Chinese mainland. The White House also said they're considering sanctions on Chinese entities and individuals because of this legislation, domestic Chinese legislation, should I say, regarding Hong Kong. Right. What are the considerations behind the Trump administration's aggressive behavior right here, Rick?
Well, first I would say it's premature to do that because passing a law does not mean that the worst is going to happen, the worst from the American perspective. So first, I think it's premature to be talking about that. But everything you have to look at through two contexts right now. One is that Mike Pompeo wants to be hawkish. He's an old-fashioned Cold War hawk, and he wants to toughen up the rhetoric with China. The second is that everything that has to do with the Trump administration between now and November has to be analyzed through the lens of politics, through the lens of re-election. Donald Trump is trailing in this election. If things don't change, he will not win re-election. And he believes, and the Republican Party believes, that attacking China is the best way to do it, and provoking China to act in a way that would reinforce what Trump is saying. And so you're going to see it in Taiwan, you're going to see it in Hong Kong, you're going to see it in Xinjiang. I think he's tried just about everything except Tibet over the last few months to try to provoke China, and thus far it really has not worked.
Talking about provocation of China, Professor Liu, last week the Trump administration notified the U.S. Congress of a possible sale to Taiwan of advanced weapons, torpedoes, for example, worth about $180 million US. How far do you think Washington is willing to go to test Beijing's bottom line?
I think from the Washington or the American government will try its best to stop the unity of Taiwan and mainland China. Try all these prosperities between the two sides. But actually, regarding the arms sale to Taiwan, I have something in different angle. We still remember 70 years before that we called the American side is the transporter or the delivery of weapons to China, because they delivered at that time many weapons and the cannons to the at that time the Kuomintang government, and then all these weapons then came to the mainland, to the Liberation Army. I think now they are making the same mistake. If they sell the advanced weapons to Taiwan authority at the moment, sooner or later, all these weapons will belong to China as a whole. I think this is a big mistake by the American side. They should consider in the long term of interest whether it's really in the interest of U.S. government and the U.S. people. So this is the real problem that between mainland and Taiwan we can unify anyhow in the time to come. But the American side cannot do anything at that time. So sales weapon is not the way to save Taiwan.
Well, we have about 45 seconds left. Rick, how far is Washington willing to go to test Beijing's bottom line regarding Taiwan?
I think they're willing to go very far, and I think that's sort of the red line with the Trump administration foreign policy would be any kind of military intervention. U.S. technically believes in reunification with Taiwan, but they've never agreed to China ruling centrally in it. So I think they're willing to go very far on that issue.
Well, that would be unfortunate. I want to thank all our guests, Professor Liu Zhiqin, Senior Fellow of Chongyang Institute at the Renmin University. Earlier with us, Jamie Fuller-Cruz, Professor at Peking University and also former CNN Bureau Chief. And last but not least, Rick Dunham, visiting scholar at Tsinghua University. And that would do it for this edition of Dialogue. I'm Wang Guo in Beijing. Thank you so much for watching.